What's going on, everybody? How you doing? It is good to be here with you in these extremely tumultuous times where news of all kinds of horrors continues to come in, plane crashes. Listen, we're gonna. I assume if you're here that maybe you know us, and so we decided to save some time doing the introductions. But my name is Chenjerai. I'm really happy to be here with my, and brilliant and colleagues. So, listen, we've all experienced this slew of executive orders, flooding the zone, whatever terms people are trying to apply it. Things coming down on everything from DEI, firing, and sort of reorganization of not only the federal government but international institutions. Promises to turn Gaza into Dubai, prioritizing the resettlement of South Africans, and just the entire sort of health funding as we confront an avian flu, and it's really disorienting, right? I mean, what people are, I think, one thing we really got clear on is that this strategy is intended, actually, though, to sort of destabilize us, right? If you're feeling kind of disoriented and confused and you can't catch your breath and can't get your bearings, that's exactly what the strategy is intended to do. So, we wanted to come together just to actually, and in some ways, both stabilize and destabilize ourselves in terms of, for enough to actually think about what's going on here. How do we need to understand this? To look at the role that corporate power, this massive extension of corporate power, is playing, and to, really have a chance to strategize and point the way forward. And so we're happy to have the moment to do this. I want to, big shout out to Haymarket Books and everyone who I know is watching, our comrades and family and community in the streets. So I just wanted to open up real quick. It occurred to me that each of us, here on this call, and all of you, we all confront this crisis from a unique kind of material standpoint, right? Like, we're all in a location, we're in a place, we're seeing people who are affected in different ways. And, I guess I wanted to ask to, my colleagues on the call here, what has this looked and felt like for you as you've seen this coming down? Like, I think starting really during the inauguration, actually. And what questions did it prompt? What does it felt like? And also, what does it make you say, man, I want to understand this better?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so in the pre-meeting, I agreed to go first to talking about this. So thanks for the kind setup, Chenjerai. It is really great to be with you all to think through this and to kind of get our bearings and maybe hopefully push ourselves to think differently. I mean, you asked this, thank you for asking me to kind of ground this in the specific place I sit, because there's so much. It has been a real onslaught. And so, I'm going to tackle this both as an organizer with the Debt Collective and as someone who has written and thought a lot about democracy. So people might know that Debt Collective has been instrumental in fighting for student loan relief. So we were pushing the Biden administration literally up until January 19th, organizing actions, literally bringing protesters to the Department of Education. We brought older debtors, a historic action of older debtors demanding relief, saying to the Biden administration, if you do not use the authority you possess, we are going to die buried in debt. Because when the Trump administration comes, we're not going to be talking about abolishing student loans. We're going to be talking about abolishing the Department of Ed, right? And we are. And even as we were saying that, I mean, I think now we're really feeling it viscerally. And what we kept hearing from the Democrats was, well, we just can't do it. It's not done that way, and we were asking them to use executive authority that had been clearly granted by Congress, right? Congress had made laws saying you have the power to cancel these debts for these groups on these terms. And so there's a kind of whiplash between that reluctance to use power to benefit people and then this total enthusiasm to use power to dispossess, to punish, to divide and conquer, and to rob people. And so that's been something we've been really thinking about and, feeling and dealing with. So here we are, the terrain has changed. And what we're trying to do is get our heads around what this means, for our members. we don't want to obey in advance and act like all our rights are just gone. No, so debtors, still have to organize and fight for the relief that they are legally entitled to, which is a whole lot. But we have to be real that the terrain has changed. So, we're paying close attention. I mean, there are so many agencies, so many public goods under attack, but the Department of Ed, they're very clear. They want to spin off and privatize the student loan portfolio. They want to attack DEI in all of its forms, all forms of equity and inclusion, and that they want to essentially, hand public education over to profiteers. This is a boondoggle for people who are invested in for-profit education. Of course, they also, went right after the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which is an agency. It's like the only agency that was consistently pissing off financiers, bankers, predatory lenders, and actually delivering, Consumer Financial Protection Bureau delivered like $21 billion into people's pockets from, tackling corporate power to some degree. So what we know, is in our movement is that the Trump administration is going to mean more debt for ordinary people, because when you attack labor, when you take away public jobs, when you take away public goods, right? It means that people are going to have to borrow. They're going to be broke. They're going to be poor. Inflation, we know, is going to go up. Prices are going to go up. So we know that the problem we've been organizing around, is more critical and urgent than ever. And so we're also thinking about the origin of our movement. So the Debt Collective has its origins in Occupy Wall Street, of course, right after the financial crisis. I'm thinking about the next financial crisis. We're in a permanent crisis. I understand that. But these guys are deep in crypto and AI, and they see those realms as too big to fail. And when they do, they want the public purse, they want public money to bail them out. And that's part of the game. And so we need to, I wish we could prevent that, but I think we need to be thinking about that on the horizon. In terms of democracy, there's a lot of factions in this movement. On the right-wing movement, we're going to talk about them. They are united by their hatred of democracy in its robust, small d, egalitarian form. And I would say one moment that really got me as someone who loves democratic philosophy, it's like, I think it was the day before the inauguration, and the New York Times had Curtis Yarvin on the homepage, who is an explicitly fascist thinker who thinks we need to get rid of democracy and have a corporate king CEO, and that was so dispiriting, because this guy is so, he's not intellectually serious. I mean, he's intellectually a joke, but an incredibly dangerous person, proudly, again, anti-democratic. And the New York Times is saying, this is the vibe shift, right? This is the kind of person we're going to put up front and center. And so I think, we need to think about how we can talk about democracy in a way that resonates, because the Democrats ran on it in a way that didn't, right? We're saving our democracy. Democracy was great. Democracy is the rule of law and procedures. And somehow that wasn't resonating with people, and for good reason. We can talk about that. And it's made space for these people who are absolutely unabashedly about consolidating power around themselves and replacing government with not just corporations getting a piece, but literally the government, the country becoming something akin to a corporation, essentially a corporation.
Wow. Yes. Thank you. Thanks, Astra. I appreciate that. So I don't know, Keeanga, what's this been like for you, just as this has all been coming down?
Thanks again, Chenjerai, for corralling, facilitating, and Haymarket for taking the initiative to organize this. It's been frustrating, frightening. It's like, I think we all knew or sort of talked about before the inauguration that this was going to be different from the first Trump run, when they were just as surprised as the rest of us that they got in. They have been anticipating either winning this election or regaining power in some form or another since they left. And so they have been organizing and planning, and that really is what Project 2025 was about, was the rollout of what 4 years out of power and planning to return look like. And so I think it has meant that whereas, the first run was kind of ham-fisted tomfoolery that, would occasionally stumble into some kind of authoritarian program, you can see that from the outset that this wasn't just, shock and awe. It wasn't the shock and awe of spectacle. There was that aspect of it, but with an actual plan behind it. And so, I think just with the spirit of the first question, I'm a university professor, and so I think the atmosphere on campus, my campus, I go to other campuses, has been one of intimidation and trepidation. I think they're from university administrators, which in the aftermath or during the Palestine protest, which they were, enthusiastically suppressing, decided because of the issue of Palestine to paint themselves into corners with this institutional neutrality, the premise that schools are here for something called education and not for administrators to weigh in on political topics. And so in some ways, they have self-neutered in order to try to hide and to kind of stay out of the crosshairs of the Trump administration. And, we can see that strategy has failed miserably. And by spending a semester threatening, punishing students, and then spending the summer rewriting rule books to basically criminalize and penalize protest on campus, when these people probably could use some campus protest as federal money gets destroyed and undermined and strangled, they have incapacitated to large degrees the forces that would normally be able to do that. Incapacitated, demoralized, and in some cases have suspended and exiled those students from campus. And so I think, to a large degree, of course, there's organizing and discussions here and there, but given the scale of attack, it's very muted right now. And I think, it's a combination of overwhelm, intimidation. It is clear, the kind of arbitrariness of the executive orders, the threats of deportation, the threats to funding with a kind of criminal administration that everyone knows they will follow through on. So it's not they aren't empty threats, and so it raises the level of calculation about how you intervene and what you do. I mean, it also raises the need for discussions that have been ongoing about solidarity, about organizing in much broader terms than really has happened on campuses in the last several years. That really we have to strategically figure out how to build bigger, that really and truly encompasses everyone who is under attack. And given the wide scale of the Trump agenda, that includes many people. I think, there's another aspect to the attacks on campus, which, Astra spoke to, but the attacks on DEI, I think there's many things to say about that. And, maybe we'll get into some of that over the course of the discussion. One thing has been very dispiriting is the way that some on the left have actually applauded these attacks because of their particular critiques with diversity, equity, inclusion programs. Some critiques in terms of the way that many of these programs were strategically implemented in a toothless way or without mechanisms, which is granted. But I think that it really misses what the overall objective of these attacks are. One is to continue to undermine and drain racism as having really any explanatory force in our society, which includes colleges and universities. So they want racism to become this meaningless thing that is just an epithet that is thrown around by liberals, is the way that they characterize it. But two is that it's intended to raise the suspicion of anyone who is not white on campuses, and particularly, not just anyone who's not white, but particularly Black people who are on campus. They want questions raised about the students. Are they deserving? Do they deserve to be there? And faculty, do they deserve to be there? Who have they cheated? What white man have they cheated out of a position to be there? Women are close on the docket. The transition of DEI from coming after Black people to going after women as well. So I think that part of that is creating an atmosphere of fear and intimidation and divisiveness, and creating suspicion within the ranks, if you will. So the last thing that I will say is, far off of campus, the raids, the systematic efforts of this administration to go after undocumented people with the hopes of terrorizing people, promoting self-deportation, and then where that does not suffice, using the powers of the state to deport people, sometimes locking people up here, entering them into a endless, confusing deportation process, or I think they've sent up to 100 people to Guantanamo Bay in Cuba, which is just bewildering, illegal, the entire gamut. And so, I think that there's a lot to kind of figure out. How this happened, why this happened, what do we do about it? But those are just some sort of opening reactions of mine, of what I've been thinking about in the last 4 weeks.
Yeah. I really relate to that. I'll jump in very briefly here just to say that I relate to that, particularly, just the atmosphere on campus. I'm here at NYU, where, NYU is essentially, the administration has been moving in lockstep with the Trump administration as it has emerged.
Goose step.
Yeah, exactly. And, folks are, and this is also happening as you're having other kinds of groups submit names to the Trump administration of people on our campus. But I would say, the way it's felt, for me, I'm part of how I respond is as, a council member on the National Association, of University Professors. And we, it's like we were already in a process of trying to invite, our colleagues and to look at higher education and to kind of push higher education to engage in more robust ways with communities, to engage in more robust ways with some of the fights that are in front of us, as a way of illustrating the possibilities of what higher education can be. And so we obviously are right in the crosshairs of the attack, because in some ways, one of the icons that this whole attack is shaped around is the woke, the woke sort of student and woke professor. But I mean, we have these executive orders. I mean, we have colleagues. I think of I just was speaking to a colleague of mine at Columbia who runs HIV research, and he was devastated because his whole apparatus and infrastructure was damaged in ways that even if the courts are able to continue to freeze these things, it's not going to be undone. Another colleague who runs a research in Burundi was also devastated. The person I've seen, and so. At the same time, we in some ways our work was very concrete. We filed, we were a plaintiff on one of the first DEI lawsuits with Democracy Forward, along with the Restaurant Organization and I think the mayor of the city of Baltimore. We've been working on helping to educate people about what these freezes mean. I also, Keeanga, I really agree with you. I mean, with all of these attacks, in some ways, I think by design, they put us in a position where the people who were pointing out the problems with federal funding, the problems with an organization like USAID, some of the limitations of certain kinds of DEI efforts, are suddenly find ourselves in a position to say, hey, while we want to be able to think critically about all those things, what's unfolding now has nothing coming out, even if it does. And so the other thing, though, I would say is that, I was, one level of this is you're also watching Democrats, sort of establishment Democrats not have any real response, really poor framings around this stuff. And, I was pleased. I think it was Naomi who's really invited us. I mean, I'm sure everyone was already understanding that, the conversations about the role that MAGA plays in an international constellation of, sort of like, really, far right power, corporate power is something people were already thinking of. But I think recently, this, in this context, it was helpful to be able to back away from our concrete tasks at the AUP, and for me to just think about what that meant. And so I became, really interested to think more about that piece of it, and to think about how that needs to shape it. I mean, one thing I'll say is, again, in the AUP, we're starting conversations about scholasticide, right? And what does it mean what would it mean to sort of stop our solidarity around, knowledge producing and cultural institutions at like American borders and not extend that to our colleagues in Palestine. And so, yeah, but it's been interesting to think about that. And I'm happy to move further into this. So I'll just pause there.
Yeah, it's great to be with all of you and listening to you, Astra, describe what you were doing right up until the final hours of the Biden administration. I think is a reminder that the sort of that we're entering into this incredibly high stakes moment already very frayed, and already with sort of shock after shock, and I know everybody here on this call and so many of the people listening have been involved in trying to stop a genocide, and have been personally impacted by climate disasters, some of which are unfolding as we gather right now in Kentucky. So it really is this polycrisis. And I think that that's part of what feels so overwhelming. Is it's like we start this already feeling like, we weren't sure how much more we could take, right? So I'm excited to talk about the strategies and the way people are rallying and the kinds of things that we can learn about how we got to this point too, because I think that this is one of the dangers as well, when the gains that we all considered too limited come under attack, right? That we lose some of the spirit of introspection, I think, that a lot of us felt after the election, and even leading up to it, of like, how could we have gotten to this point, right? When we all met in person in New York, we were talking about, really reckoning with the left's lack of power in the electoral cycle, right, and how it got to that point. So I want us to hold on to that, even though it's very hard, right, because in a moment of attack like this, we want to defend, and we have to defend, but it is that complicated, I think, stance where we have to do both. I've described it a little bit as, really understanding the depths of the rage coming at the left, coming at workers at these tech companies, coming at universities. I don't think we fully understood how much it pained our corporate overlords to make even the most minor changes, right? And I think it's because really, I think they feel like the contract was changed on them, right? I mean, if we're thinking about somebody like Musk or Thiel, or even Zuckerberg, they came up in this age of absolute adulation for wealth, right? Just making tons of money in the dot-com boom was enough to have you lauded as, the second coming. And then all of a sudden they start facing some accountability from their workers. They start having to think about what they say. They start having to, they're pushed by racial justice reckonings, and they're starting to wonder, well, what is power for, if not for abusing? And this is what I think Trump represents to billionaires everywhere. He's the guy who never cared, right? He's like pre-1990s political correctness. He's from the 80s, right? So he is just the guy who never did anything but use and abuse his wealth and power, right? Whether it's walking into the women's change rooms at, beauty pageants or whatever it was, right? It was, his brand was, because I'm rich, I can do it, and he built an empire around that idea. Not just, we all know he's a bad businessman, but that is the idea he was selling. This is what we have to understand. And so as this is a corporate coup, but I think it is specifically needs to be understood as a Silicon Valley coup. Not to say everybody else isn't getting a piece of it, but the extent to which this is about those tech executives who had been pushed by their workers, the rage that they felt, for instance, at being pushed, to not take the Maven contract, the tech workers who challenged, contracts with police, with the military, with the Israeli government. That sort of, I think lots of people in the labor movement maybe didn't even take some of that tech worker organizing all that seriously because it wasn't in the form of a union. But boy, did these guys take it seriously, right? So we're in this strange situation where we have a full-on counter-revolution, but we never got the revolution. So what we got were some limited gains, right? But the problem is the gains were unevenly distributed, as we all know, right? And so they're not the kinds of gains necessarily that are going to people are going to defend with the level of intensity with which they're being attacked, right? So I just want to kind of map that a little bit and think about that, because I also think that there's something important for us to understand about that we were really onto something here with that tech organizing, a lot of which was interrupted by the pandemic, right? I'm thinking about the kind of coalition that blocked Amazon from getting their headquarters in New York, right? A lot of this was 2018, 2019, and the a lot of it got it wasn't able to reach its full maturity because of the pandemic. It's also worth remembering the Google walkout, which was over a huge payout for sexual abuse, by a Google executive. So it's all of these ways in which social movements were holding them a little bit accountable, right? And this is this ferocious counter response, right? And that's just one glimpse of the counter revolution without the full revolution, right? So yeah, I've been thinking about that. my position, I'm speaking to you from one of the countries that Trump wants to annex or has talked about. So, that's something. And it's one of these things where it's like, I can't even say it without laughing. But, I have this line where I quote Philip Roth in Doppelganger, where, he says it's too ridiculous to take seriously and too serious to be ridiculous.
Yes.
And I said at the time, maybe this is kind of like a mantra for our era, but I really feel that way because we don't know, like, is this like the plot of like a bad John Candy movie, or is this really happening, right? and the thing is, I think if you look at Trump and his, prioritizing of his relationship with Netanyahu, with Putin, it is a solidarity of people who just grab territories because they can, right? So I think that what we are in is, and I'm not the first person to say this, but what is clear is that the counter-revolution is against the entire post-Second World War, liberal order, all international humanitarian law. When you have and this relates very much to Gaza, because this is one of the first talking points that we got from the Netanyahu government about why they were allowed to commit genocide was Dresden, as if there never were Geneva Conventions in response to the Second World War, as if the entire humanitarian architecture didn't exist, right? And so it was already, it's like Astra said, about democracy. It doesn't exist, but we'll miss it when it's gone. Same thing with the international humanitarian liberal order. It never existed. The U.S. always had a veto. The Security Council always was a veto on the promise of a democratic United Nations. They never applied, the ICC never applied to the United States, et cetera, et cetera. So it was, but there was the promise and there was the idea. And then there was some limited application, and then Netanyahu just decimated the whole thing, right? And so now, when Trump is saying, well, maybe we'll make, we'll give away Ukraine and not even invite Ukrainians to the meeting, and maybe, we can actually just take Gaza. We could, I have it because I said so. And you have all these like New York Times journalists going, can he do that? Don't we have doesn't the Geneva Convention say something about this? And they haven't mentioned the Geneva Convention, for 2 years, right? So we, I think it would be dangerous to lose that order that never was. And I think it's like, as Astra has always said about democracy, I think it's an invitation to actually it's a nice idea. We should try it. We should actually try it. So, I mean, the other thing I would just say, obviously I've been studying this sort of tactic for a long time. I think we should understand Elon's boys running roughshod over the U.S. government within a long lineage of boys who have done such things, like the Chicago boys, in Chile, like the Harvard boys in Russia, like the Berkeley Mafia in Indonesia, like the, Heritage Foundation interns in Iraq after the U.S. invasion. And this is kind of the boomerang coming home, as Noor Arakat said. But that's, and that said, I hope we can dig into this a little bit later. I still think that even though we can draw these historical lineages, we are, when you succeed at this play for more than half a century, the terrain changes, and indeed the planet changes. So what they need is different, right? And so I think that there is a apocalypticism to this stage of the project that is different from earlier stages, precisely because they have been so successful, and they have now unleashed forces that are well beyond the ability to even pretend you can control. So really all you can imagine is a kind of a fortress response. So in lots of ways, I think that the best way to understand what we're seeing is not like old school imperialism, but a kind of a supersized prepperism, in the sense that they know what is being unleashed in terms of of humanity needing to move to get to safety. And we're seeing many different kinds of visions of fortress worlds, right? So I think like the Bannon base, the MAGA base, the vision is just the fortress border, whereas a Peter Thiel is imagining like a fully privatized corporate state, right? And so there are tensions there to explore. But I'm really kind of thinking about the limits of how I understood this project in the past, and I'm trying to understand the planet as a player in this.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I mean, I relate to so many pieces of that. One sort of very brief anecdote I give is I have an acquaintance who works in the tech sector who I know has, is definitely a celebratory of the power of corporations and so forth. But just as a reminder of what you're saying, I mean, every time I try to raise the issue of, climate in relation to like AI or crypto, he doesn't go in the places I thought he would go. He goes into like, well, but we're going to be on Mars soon. Or like he goes into like, at one point he started saying, we're actually participating in the next evolution of humanity through AI, as though like that's going to replace us. So you start to see some really wild and interesting ideas along with, mixed in with the usual tech libertarianism, or maybe as an extension of it. And and I think all of this points to that as being one particular kind of faction on the right, and then other sort of right factions and expressions in politics. So on that note, I was wondering if we could kind of go into that, because we know that the sort of like liberal establishment in the United States, there's so many ways that they fail to even characterize what we're up against. And it's really, even when you're in this urgency, it's really important to slow down and know what you're up against, because otherwise all your tactics, your strategies, your understanding of what's unfolding is going to be insufficient. One of the many ways, and one we really wanted to lean into in this talk, is that it's, people talk about these things in like really restrictive domestic terms, like it's just the U.S., things specific to the U.S., when it's really clear that there's a much broader thing going on as one of many ways. So I guess I'll turn to, I don't know who wants to answer this first, but, how should we really characterize this right-wing alignment, right? What are the constituencies? What are they after? What do we see as their strategies? Where are some of the fractures? I mean, let's really try to dig into this for a minute.
So I want to dig into that, and then Naomi raised 1 million things that I also.
Oh,
no,
well, yeah.
like,
Let's not.
rightfully,
Well, to
that
your
I
thing,
also.
let's not talk in parallel. We don't rush it. Yeah, Phil agreed. We'll get to it.
So I just want to. I mean, of course, it's all related, but one of the things that that Naomi raised that I think is really important is the dynamic of the counter revolution without the revolution. And I think, we have been living through, I mean, this is the way that I've been thinking about this, through a kind of unfulfilled radicalization, really from 2008. In terms of how I'm thinking about this, the financial crisis of 2008 and the forces that unleashed, including a revulsion of capitalism, right? This was in the American context, when this is a few years after Hurricane Katrina, where the sort of underlying theme of that discussion was the analysis of what happened with Katrina was all the ridiculous Black people who didn't evacuate, even though everyone knew that this was coming. So you have the narrative about poor Black people and that their own behavior cost them their lives, and also undermined any sort of real effort at any kind of federal response. So instead, Black people were treated like refugees. I mean, they were literally called refugees when they were dispatched from New Orleans to Houston, to Utah, uh, all over the country. And then the rebuilding done completely on neoliberal terms, where it's just a bonanza, a grab bag for the corporate elite. And so the 2008 crisis reveals the extent to which the economic precarity that billions of people were living with is because of the greed and recklessness of the bankers and the financiers on Wall Street. I mean, it was a huge ideological transformation that opens the path for the Arab Spring, that opens the path for Occupy Wall Street, that brings into an everyday parlance of Americans, which is unheard of, the 99% and the 1%. And this also open discussion about inequality creates pathways for the emergence of Black Lives Matter that brings together both racism and economic inequality as a feature of American capitalism. And the problem, of course, and then, in some ways, the pandemic stymies this, but it also illustrates yet again the just the greed, the recklessness, the kind of manufactured ineptness of the American state when it comes to the care and the health of the public. A country that can somehow, pinpoint people to drop missiles on in wedding parties in Pakistan can't find ventilators from Michigan, can't find, scrubs for nurses in New York. And so all of this sort of spills over into these massive protests in this country, 26 million people thereabout, but globally, there are protests globally. But you don't win just because you're right. No social movement or mass movement or whatever is entitled to victory. And so in many ways, we're looking at the repercussions of what happens when you don't win, right? And it's fucking brutal. And so I think one of the things that we as a left, people who give a shit, have to figure out is what happened? What was that about? And that, that's a big question that has to do with politics. It has to do with organization and how you consolidate whatever victories that you have along the way, how you understand mistakes, how you pivot from those. And so I will just say, one of the things that I've been thinking about, not necessarily as a mistake, but if we're assessing what as a movement we did, and what worked and what didn't work, one of the things that I'm thinking about, and maybe I'll be pilloried for this, but that's okay. Trump's in
no draft folders anymore.
Is the way that we focused in 2020 on defunding the police. And what I mean with that is not that, yes, we should defund the police, we should defund, the prison system, the military, we should defund all of it. But in terms of the entry points for regular people into a movement, I think one of the things that we were trying to highlight is that we have all of this social inequality that has made people vulnerable to COVID, that has killed people, that poverty makes people vulnerable to disease, the essential workers, that poverty makes people vulnerable to policing, to the criminal justice system in this country. And so what would happen if instead of funding the police, we funded the conditions of life that would not make people vulnerable to disease and policing in the criminal justice system? Wouldn't that be better to do? And yes, of course it would be better to do. But to me, thinking about this, over the last several months, is it requires such a high level of political commitment to come to the conclusion that the main aim of our movement in 2020 should be defunding the police. Is the bar set too high in coming to that conclusion? Is there an easier entry point into organizing politics than that? Especially when I think that a lot of people we want better policing in our communities because we're vulnerable to the crime that arises from social inequality. And so in many situations, people are given either false choices or bad choices. Right. And so are we doing that as well? The choice is either defund the police or go do your own thing, because that's what our movement is focused on. And I'm thinking about this, and there's obviously more to say with that, but I'm thinking about it in the context of what does it mean to try to organize on a mass level and to truly bring in the numbers of people that would be necessary to thwart the kind of attack that we see now. And I think the need for mass movement can sometimes seem abstract. It can seem triumphalist even to talk about that. But if you look at the situation that we're in now, where these powerful people are like, screw your courts, we don't care. It's illegal, we don't care. What is the social force that actually exists to stop them? They don't care about the courts. They don't care about Chuck Schumer waving his fist at some rally in Washington, D.C. They don't care about tweets. They don't care about mean things that are said about them. They don't care that you don't like them. They don't care if you call them out. And so what then is the social force that is able to stop them? Well, we could look at South Korea. We could look at any number of places that have mobilized in the face of political coups, administrative coups, however you want to categorize this, when the rich and the elite simply don't care about the existing legal framework. And so when you think about it in those terms, the need for mass movement, not just the movement of the already convinced, the movement of your friends, the movement of small numbers of people, but a mass movement comes into a different focus. And how do we get to that becomes a real living question, and is no longer an abstraction. So there's lots more to say, but I'll stop at that. I thought the counter-revolution without the revolution is an invitation to understand why the revolution didn't actually happen.
I want to ask Chenjerai a question, following up on that, because or else Chenjerai won't talk enough, and he'll just keep asking us questions. I mean, following up on what Keeanga just said, with your communication hat on, professor of journalism and maker of media, award-winning media, what do you like? I've been increasingly feeling like the limits of our reach. I feel like social media has fooled us into thinking that we have more communication reach than we do. And to the extent, and by what I mean by that is, we do have the power to get slogans out, like Keeanga said, like something like defund the police. But we don't actually have the power to make the meaning behind that. So what's happened is that every left slogan has had its meaning projected onto it now by the right. Like, it's the right who's saying what defund the police means, right? So I'm just wondering what you're thinking about, like what that means for us. Because on one level, it's not our responsibility if we're being misunderstood, but what do you think?
Yeah, no, but thank you for sort of seizing the conversation into a conversation out of any kind of thing. I think, one thing I think is that one connector between what you're saying and what Keeanga's saying is that we have to think about what winning messages are. I mean, I fully agree with the idea that we want to have we need to build a mass movement. We have to have real leverage, and that means we have to, the terms that I know people on this call are familiar with, but we do have to build our bases. I think I heard actually you Keeanga say recently, there's going to be times where we got to march separately, but we still got to fight together. And so I think that one issue is to really have the kind of deliberative spaces in our movement where we can have some very hard discussions about what we're going to project, because I think that, like you said, you look at defund the police and, well, this is actually the second thing, right? Defund the police is an interesting thing. And I'm glad you brought this very, controversial point up, because it points that with Occupy, with so many of our movements, we're trying to politically educate at the same time that we're trying to sort of do the movement leverage thing, right? You're trying to do both. And, and I know you agree with me, Keeanga, one great thing defunding did was that it put funding on the table with policing. So we're not just talking about like a rogue cop with use of force. People actually started to think about the funding a little bit. But it is true that was not necessarily a unifier with all the bases that we wanted to do. So that was already a kind of a pre-existing problem on the left, is that, in some communities, people weren't feeling that, right? And then those rifts were exploited by the right attack against defund. And in some ways, you talk about Eric Adams as one expression of what's going on right here on the sort of almost cartoonish levels of whatever's happening with him, but also horrific. I mean, my friend John Teufel made the point that in some ways, a whole Democratic establishment got behind Eric Adams. At one point there was people talking about Eric Adams might be a presidential candidate, but it was because it allowed themselves to distance themselves from Black Lives Matter, from defund in a way, right? So I think that, but anyway, I think that and on your point, to the point you're making, Naomi, about social media, I agree. I mean, it's really hard to grapple with the fact that there's incredible, innovative political education happening on social media all the time, and yet I mean, I don't know. I think it warrants some thinking. Off the dome, I would say, if all that social media stuff is not combined with actual leverage, with a movement which has real leverage, then you lose the ability to define the terms. You're vulnerable in all these ways, and someone can just reclaim the thing because it's, in a way, it was kind of just out there in the cloud, and you have no sense when you have a real base that's being, kind of like disciplined and building the message together with real leverage. Then your movement can't be diffused just because someone even attacks your slogan. That's the other thing, no matter what your messaging is. So, I mean, that's my off the dome thoughts, but it's a really great question. I don't know, Astra, you have thoughts about where we're going, or
Oh my
on
God,
this
there's
front?
so much said. I think, we talked in one of our previous conversations about how slogans shouldn't have footnotes, right? They shouldn't need to be explained. And I think that's a really good principle. But I think what Chenjerai is saying about, the force to back them up is really important. I mean, we are the 99%, I thought was like one of the greatest slogans. But Occupy changed the conversation. It did not, change the balance of power in this country because of the sort of DNA of the movement, which was, refused to make demands and didn't want to.
Bernie wouldn't have happened without it.
Absolutely. I mean, it was so important. I love Occupy, but there's something about the way it was catalyzed and what its values were. But I think, I'm connecting this to the question Chenjerai asked that we kind of went over, which is, who's in the right-wing coalition? It's like a whole motley freaking crew of freaks. It's like Silicon Valley tech bros, private equity strippers that are stripping the country for parts. There's Christian social conservatives. There's like Maha, Make America Healthy weirdos. There's MAGA diehards. There's, libertarians. There's, all of these sorts of people, but they wouldn't have won the election without this like faux economic populism, right? Which is kind of, we are the 99% kind of stuff, right? Like, you can't pay your bills, you can't buy the stuff you want. And so a mass movement to me, like, that is the stuff of it. We kind of know what a mass movement needs to speak to, which is like people's real material needs. And and what we failed to do, I think, is like build the infrastructure that can meet that, meet that hunger. And I think that's where like the fracture in the right-wing coalition is, in that they're not going to deliver to those folks. And how do we take advantage of that? And so that probably does mean messaging in a way that speaks to those kinds of concerns that are overlapping among lots of different constituencies, but ultimately, like, how do we build organizations that hold those people? But I think that's where the opportunity is. I mean, all of the other constituencies in the right-wing groupings, they're like I think they're Christian conservatives may be an exception, but they're smaller cohorts of people. So I don't know, the slogan thing is hard. Like, I think it is true. If Naomi said this, if you're explaining yourself, you're losing. If you're explaining your slogan, you're already kind of a step behind. I don't know. And then I think this is not a strategy, but it's like, I think we do need to reckon with the fact that we are, on the back foot. Our side is small. And there's a moment when it was like, oh, are we more popular than we thought? This is great. It felt, like maybe, wow, the polls show everybody wants Medicare for all. And, Bernie's the most popular politician in the country, and he still is today. But that doesn't mean that the left is strong. And I think we need, reckoning
because the left has not figured out how to be an actual left and organize to capture that groundswell of public opinion. So you have all these grifters who just come in and pivot and drain it. I just want to make two quick points. I mean, one is like, if we're thinking internationally, and I think that we should, and obviously it's just us talking, so we don't, we are not representing in any way the span of like the global rise of the authoritarian right, but it is a global movement, and it is animated by hatred of the left, and overwhelmingly hatred of migrants. Like, that's certainly the uniting force in the, like, connecting the European right and the Canadian right and the U.S. right. I think it's a little different if we're looking at like a figure like Modi, and that it's more anti-Muslim and less anti-migrant. But there's definitely always has to be a hated out group, right? I'm a little, like, I've been thinking about something that Richard Seymour, who, editor of Salvage, who wrote, very good book called Disaster Nationalism, has been saying about cautioning about thinking that we can only respond with the so-called bread and butter issues, right? Because one of the things that I'm struck by, in listening to a lot of MAGA media, as you all know, is like there is this, like, it's really a very kind of I use the phrase apocalyptic. I mean, there are these sort of like these final, it's all about these final battles, right? And you're fighting for like the soul of the country and things like that. So I think we do have to yes, we need to be talking about meeting people's most urgent needs and cost of living and rent and all of it. But it needs to be knitted together by a really, I think we need a prophetic voice. I think we need to.
I totally agree. Yeah.
Yeah. And this is why I've been talking about really understanding these people as like traitors to humanity, like to life, right? Like, I mean, if all they're thinking about is how do we just grab what we need and then build our fortress, right? They have truly given up. And I think we need to highlight the extent to which this is a deeply nihilistic project. And certainly when it comes to some of it's, religious end times stuff, which is terribly scary because that is part of the coalition that Astra didn't mention, and where Palestine fits in with that, because, this is where the final battle takes place. And, I heard Peter Thiel say that Greta is the Antichrist, which was then echoed by J.D. Vance in his weird speech in Europe, right? So there's this kind of end times narrative of like, okay, God is, like second coming, and there's going to be the chosen who are lifted up to a castle in the sky. And then there's a secular version of that story, which is we, the chosen Americans, get to build our fortress. And then there's a tech version, which is we, the rich people, get to build our sort of corporate states. But they've all given up. They see terrible things. They see atrocities as signs that, they're accelerationists. So I think I think in addition to all of the organizing that needs to happen, I think that it is a combination of the sort of meeting of daily needs and really animating our movements with a profound sense of purpose. Like, talk about we are alive in this, like the last years when we can prevent death on an unfathomable scale. And that's like I think it's a sacred duty. And I don't think we should be afraid to animate our movements with a sense of that level of purpose and commitment to each other and to this planet. I think there's a spiritualism to that. I mean, sorry, Keeanga, I know you're going to roll your eyes at me, but I I'm fine with Astra.
And heroism, right? Like there's a lot of
serialist to the core,
heroic stuff in their messaging too. Like
what? But there's a cultural aspect that Naomi is talking about, that the right has completely captured, right? And that part of that is making the left appear to be or described as humorless, as just gray, and kind of just not very interesting. And so that's part of I think the appeal of MAGA and of even the sort of more global phenomenon of the clown fascism, is the humor and the fun, which is often at the expense of other people. But there's something cohering in that, in a world that has very little else to offer people. And so, I don't take that as that's what we need to mimic. But no, we can't just, roll out the statistics, and the appeals to this or that program, especially when, this is one of the things that with the Democratic Party and the kind of obsession with the institutions, right? And what feels like the status quo, that their constant sort of reference back to the existing institutions, and so I'm not exactly sure what that looks like, even if I feel like I know what you're referring to. And I feel that often also in some of the political spaces that I've inhabited, right? It's almost a dourness, a quickness to point out why you're wrong and where you deviate from what it is that we're arguing or saying. And there's something, there's just something that is at its core level just not appealing. And so beyond the issue of the bread and butter politics, how does the left make itself appealing? I don't know.
I mean, I think one thing I would say is I think that the struggle around Palestine has taught us a lot in that regard. I mean, one of the things, although these encampments were characterized as just like angry people, I think that part of the reason why they grow so rapidly is because they were spaces of people being recharged, people combining political analysis, really sharp. I mean, I'm trying to get my students to read in class. They were out there in the middle of the night doing teachings, and then people were bringing like maklaba, sharing faith traditions. I mean, in some ways, the encampments embodied everything the university tries to pretend to be in ways that it never could do within the classrooms, right? And within the building. So I think, and spirituality. I mean, I think like those things, that offers us one version of a political movement that's deeply, materialist and at the same time, just rife with cultural power. One other thing I wanted to say on the right wing thing is that, earlier in February when the sort of, New Patriots far right coalition gathered in Madrid, Orban, who's sort of, him and Marine Le Pen are like sort of behind the scenes leaders. They've dubbed the, Santiago as the head of president. But Orban gave this speech and I thought it was really telling. He said, "The example of Hungary proves that a country can be successful even if you refuse to follow what the global elite dictates. This elite has been dealt a major blow by Donald Trump. Now it's our turn, the turn of the patriots to finish the job in Brussels." And, there's so much going on there that I think we can, in some ways, the fact that this is broad and is sort of like spatially broad and also temporally broad, like, because they're citing in the context of this, you're seeing the term Reconquista come back. They're citing like Franco terms, right, to re-energize that, and those sort of rhetoric of expulsion, pushing the foreigners out. Like the fact that it's temporarily broad, there's a long history, and it's all over, could seem like a dark doom type of thing. But I actually think what it means is that there's been people who have resisted that and overcome that, and I fully agree with Naomi's thing about, let's not just reduce this to like, oh, it's the exact same playbook. We need to talk about what's new in the terrain, but we also need to tap in, since our sort of establishment people here have no imagination, there's a far bigger repertoire in that history and in these different places for how to resist this thing that's going on. So I just wanted to mention those things.
I think there are, Astrid, unless you were going to jump in, I think there are opportunities around rifts, like just untenable levels of that in that coalition. I've been trying to think a lot about it and not like I think people got really excited when Musk and Bannon seemed to be fighting, right? And it's like, oh, this is an irreversible rift here, and then look, that's why Musk did the salute, just to signal, hey, we're on the same team here, right? I mean, that was just straight. That was, and then it all seemed to disappear. People weren't so worried about H-1B visas anymore after that. So it actually worked, right? It did what it was supposed to do. I didn't think that was going to be the rift, although I feel like people haven't really reckoned enough with the fact that deportations are the economic plan, according to Bannon, that's the job creation program. And so I think that's important for us to think about and counter. But where I think there's a more significant rift than over something than whether or not the Silicon Valley is going to get their visas has to do with the human. Because what I was saying before, it's not just a corporate coup, it is a Silicon Valley coup. And at the center of it is AI, right? And this is where the sort of flurry of executive orders and everybody, going off in all directions, where we really need to sort of understand the pattern, like how does it possibly make sense for them to be, laying off people in such huge numbers and decimating this government? Okay, so yes, they want to fill the gaps, but they want to fill it with AI, very specifically. And so a lot of this started, like they showed their hands in the early days of COVID, where you had a big lobbying campaign for people like Eric Schmidt saying, okay, China's getting ahead of us. They're using AI in healthcare. People are having like AI doctors, in education, like much more remote schooling. And they tried to use the pandemic to push through a whole bunch of this stuff, right? And it only got so far. And now we're seeing another huge push using China once again. And they want to step into the breach around AI weapons, AI health, AI education, and all of these things that were blocked, including like self-driving vehicles. It is, I think we should talk about the danger of this, but I also think we should talk about the opportunity of this, because this is where I see the biggest rift with the Trump base. It is the most anti-human agenda. And I can tell you from listening to hundreds of hours of Bannon, he's obsessed with what he calls big tech warfare, right? And he has completely co-opted the language of the left around the working class. And there is nothing more anti-working class than these technologies. And so, I don't think we're going to succeed in peeling everyone away, but I think there are a lot of people who are not fully on board with every part of Trumpism, that might, be open to a framing around just how just dystopian all of this is. I don't know. So yeah, to me, it's the most productive rift, and it's one that we need to jump on because it's moving so fast.
Yeah, and just to back you up on that, JD Vance gave that AI speech in France, right? Yeah, and so he, of course, has gone on and on about education for years, about how professors are the enemy and public education is evil. It was like the first time I heard him talk about positive vision. It was like 2 sentences, and it was AI will join with your student. AI and the students will become one, and young people will learn how to work with AI, right? It's a positive vision that has no constituency. It's not positive, right? It's, and I think you're right that there's something that is deeply repulsive to most people about what they're offering there. I mean, when we were talking about slogans, I think like one of the best slogans on the right took it is being pro-life. And it's something that maybe we should try to reclaim, It's like, no, we're pro-life. Maybe we can never do that. But
that's gone.
It's gone. Yeah. But yeah. I think that as they,
that was my working title.
That, it's like yes, I don't know. It was just like such a, gross idea of what education is for. I mean, it's one thing to like rail against the cultural elites and like energize your base, but that is not like red meat for any group of voters.
Yeah. Actually, we have a question that I don't know if we want to continue to talk about these rifts because I think that's important. So don't let me rush that if others have more to say about the rifts on the right. We do have an interesting question that I was going to pose, which is that.
Can I just?
Of course, yes.
I'm just going to throw this out, and then you can ask the question. And is there any potential around? Well, I don't know. This baffling hypocrisy around speech is driving me crazy. That JD Vance goes to Europe to go on and on and on about the beauty, the power, the necessity, the existential being of free speech, while one, not mentioning the suppression of speech in Europe in particular around Palestine. I mean, you literally, is it in Germany, you can't use Arabic on on public protests. You know, you can't have a Palestinian flag. But also here, if there's the suppression of Palestinian protests, but most of the DEI attacks are either anti-worker, like they're using it to fire people, to lay people off, to get rid of jobs, but it's an enormous attack on speech and what people have the right to say or talk about in terms of diversity, history. You know, the wrestler mogul Linda McMahon doesn't know if schools will be defunded if they teach African American history. And so I just wonder if the insane levels of hypocrisy around the question of speech, because they've held this up as like their own banner, that part of their revulsion of the left is the left's policing of speech. And it, you know, the mainstream media is always a baffling phenomenon. Like these obvious conflicts that deserve some explanation never seem to get posed. And so I don't, you know, is it a rift? I don't know, because they just lie. But it does seem like, especially in this country where our freedom of speech is held up to be this sacrosanct part of what it means to be American. And it is so obvious that, you know, maybe it's not obvious that part of these attacks on, a big part of these attacks on DEI have to do with simple expression. Like you can't mention the word diversity. Like, what the hell is that? Anyway, that's questions, rants, comment.
I mean, I will say that I think that's a good question, and because especially these things are increasingly so far-reaching, and one thing I would say is that you know, the way that the speech issue overlaps with the defunding of these institutions and the sort of, you know, that is certainly an opportunity that many of these organizations are looking at, which you talked about. I don't know if there's enough people who out there who are like really fired up about their right to protest that, you know, that's by itself. But for example, I was looking today, like the list of terms that can flag like a grant or shut something down, which I heard today. Women, yes, exactly. Those things I think become a moment where there's an increasing number of people.
We were the ones who were supposed to not be allowed to say woman.
Right. No, I know. No, exactly.
Everyone agrees.
The other thing is that I think, you know, there's a organization that's called like looking at the Reactionary International, trying to do research on what's happening in Europe, and their assessment is that these taking a chainsaw to all these things, and this is not actually that popular. The reason why they're actually doing it is not because it actually has popularity, but because, interestingly, Orban and Netanyahu, for example, know the power of the kind of institutions that they're chopping because they benefited from them initially, right? Like Viktor Orban, you know, he built his whole infrastructure initially with subsidies from Soros money in the early days of the party. Bibi, you know, was relying on support from the National Endowment for Democracy. Same thing with Netanyahu. So they saw what this does, and they're determined to shut down the potential for that on the left. But they're not doing it because it's popular. And I think it's not popular. I think they're overreaching. So I don't know.
I do wonder
your question.
No, I mean, I think it's funny because, well, I've been talking with a friend about whether to write a piece about hypocrisy and how like pointing out hypocrisy is always a problem, right? Because they're such hypocrites, and how we need to look for the contradictions in what they're doing, right? What are how come, because it's so maddening. And I think on the speech, I don't know, I just wonder about how we tie it to, you know, the long very effective legal tradition of saying, yes, free speech for corporations, right? Free speech for the rich. I mean, part of what Musk said on that stage was, we need free speech for neo-Nazis, but also if we can listen to Greta Thunberg for years, right? Then you can listen to, the richest man in the world, Elon Musk, meaning he should have the right to buy as much speech, to buy as much influence. So I think that somehow, and we were talking about Occupy, like that part of Occupy's anger was around Citizens United, the idea that, rich people should be able to buy as much influence over elections, and call that speech. So I just, I think part of our pushback needs to be not just, free speech as a principle, I think is good, but also really being like, they are wielding this as a weapon.
I think it's less about pointing out the hypocrisy than having an actual contrast that exposes their fraudulence, right? And this is like the thing why
Fraudulence.
Yes. It's completely fraudulent. But I do think that like somebody like Bannon is playing with fire by speaking as much as he does about corporate control of the media and the tech oligarchs and techno-feudalism. He's clearly been reading the Haymarket backlist. He was talking about elite capture this morning.
Whoa.
Yeah.
You need an award for listening to that guy. I do like one
fucking Mirror World.
I think I think it's important because it once this is out of the bottle, right? And so when you have somebody like Sean Fain actually out there with talking about eating the rich, but actually trying to get people a contract that's going to help them pay the bills. That's a threat. That's a threat because they're scammers. They're all scammers. Bannon they're all selling nonstop, right? The amount of ads, it's actually very hard to listen, mostly because there's so many ads. And one of the things that I find really interesting is that they're still selling all this apocalyptic stuff, even though they control every part of the government, right? They're selling, buy gold. You never know what's the economy's about to crash. Get ready to eat meals. So it's still holding on to this idea that the apocalypse is about to come. So anyway, I do think that we can get at it, but not by going, hey, you said. I think it's about actually, running real, democratic socialists against them. And that's what they most fear, right? They love running against corporate Democrats. They love it. That is a fantastic fight that they will win and win and win and win.
Every time.
Every fucking time. So.
Astra, write that piece.
On the list.
The real fraud in government.
The real fraud. Oh, man.
Okay, that question.
The question comes in from Jen Johnson, and it's the right has a clear dictated platform in Project 2025, as Keeanga reflected on regrouping from the last term, and messages and actions come from it. Does a left that believes in collective platform building need an established platform that better unites positions and messages? And to Naomi's point, are we capable of organizing something like that?
Is that Jen Johnson from Chicago?
I'm not sure, but shout out to Jen. Thank you for
I hope
question.
so.
Yeah.
Well,
don't say yes we can, because that's got some baggage. I think we can. I think we've come close. This is the thing. What you were saying, Keeanga, earlier, but this is the cost of not winning. We can't forget that.
So close.
So close. And this is, I think we have such profound. We're all carrying around really deep disappointments, right? And some of the disappointments are with our own side, and things that we've blown, right? And some of it is, I think, legit, and some of it is just what happens when you lose, right? But one of the things the right has done really well is hold up a mirror to the worst parts of us, to our worst moments, right? That's the whole sort of libs of TikTok sort of strategy and the kind of mockery. And we know from being on the left that the left can be total assholes. And, some of us have had it, like we all know, right? And so I think it's important, while course correcting and learning from that, to also remember that we're not just those worst moments, that we are also the left that, had millions of people in the streets in 2020 in the largest protests in US history. And we are also the left that had, global climate strikes in 2019. And we're also the left that, came closer than any generation before us to getting a democratic socialist in the White House and doing something, similar in the UK under Corbyn. And it's the closeness, right? I don't know, when I was coming up as a leftist, we didn't get that close, right? So maybe the disappointments weren't as severe. The stakes are higher, but we're more than our worst moments. And we need to remember what we did, and the platforms that were written. And we're not starting from zero. We've got all kinds of ideas waiting around, to quote Milton Friedman. But somebody else come in there with the platform.
Yeah. Any other thoughts about whether we, need a sort of united platform and, how we get there?
2025 was, they've been doing that year after year after year after year. It wasn't called Project 2025, but, it was something that they were doing, regularly as a place to envision, their laundry list of ideal policies. And, if you listen to conservatives talk about it, they're like, oh, actually, a lot of different types of people wrote this. It's not everybody in it was in total agreement. There's some contradictions. And I do think there are certain things we can take from the left. There's kind of a weird recursive thing, like when we're talking about the left being dour and the right being more, I hate to call them fun, whatever, energized, memeified. They say, we've taken the energy of the 60s, right? We are the counterculture now. And they're self-consciously copying that. And so maybe, one thing we can copy from
without the fun stuff.
What we need to,
I think they probably do have the fun stuff. They just don't talk about it.
I think we should meme and talk shit more and troll more. I do not think that they should have a monopoly on trolling. But I think they also shouldn't have a monopoly on, big, bold policies. I think bold policies are part of what's going to galvanize people and provide that, vision and that sense of larger purpose that Naomi was talking about. I think one thing that's on my mind as Doge, rips through the government, playing on decades of bipartisan talk about how government's the enemy and waste, fraud, and abuse need to be cut, is a radical vision of good government, and how do you make a state that actually, excites people, that provides for people, that makes people feel connected, that makes people feel solidarity. I mean, sometimes you shouldn't see the state. We were talking about environmental disasters, and a lot of my family's in Western North Carolina. And one thing people don't know is that in 2021, I think, this North Fork Dam spillover project that cost $38 million was finished. And because of that, a huge fucking area, 16 miles from a town of Black Mountain into Asheville, North Carolina, was not decimated, right? People built something, they fixed something actually. And because of that, huge amount of life was saved, right? And money was saved as well. And I think there's something about when the left is also thinking about governing and how to govern well, I think we need to think about how we make that into something people understand and appreciate and see and don't take for granted. And so that's a challenge that's just on my mind in these last few weeks as, Musk suddenly makes this very old school Republican thing of sledgehammering the state and trying to drown the state in the bathtub suddenly look kind of cool and novel. I don't know.
The one thing that I would say is that being able to get to a point of having a platform of any sort requires a big culture shift in the left, because that is about politics. It's about debate, political education, and collaboration. It's about democracy within the movement, or whatever process that one constitutes in order to create that kind of thing. And one of the things that I've written about and think a lot about is this aspect of movement culture, and how we create a collaborative, open left with multiple entry points, that is easily accessible, that welcomes politics, that welcomes tension, political tension, that is not acrimonious but is productive, and that can collaborate in such a way as to agree about a platform. But I also think that this is more, it's more than just that. I think one of the things that the right has done is create institutions that, create mock legislation, that have think tanks, that create white papers that they pass to elected officials that are really talking points. In some ways it's easier for the right, because they have more access to money, because their ideas reinforce the status quo. It means that they're less of a threat and confrontational, and they get funded. But if you think about the last 15 years and the enormous amount of money that has circulated on the left, through foundations, through donations, the fact that we have such little kind of institutionalization coming out of that is part of the problem, and it is a sign of just not taking ourselves seriously as an entity that should be influencing politics. And so this is part of, you can't just come up with a platform and, here's what we think and here's what we believe, but what are the processes that need to be developed in order for something like that to take place? And that conversation is really about envisioning a much different kind of movement culture than we have had thus far.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'll jump into just on that. I was thinking about something similar, which is that even in this environment where so many organizations are under attack and their funding is under attack, we have to be able to, I think, render a critique that says, when you don't have the kind of institutions that you're talking about, when you don't have the kind of processes and vision that everyone here is talking about, and the ability to, really forge what's your program in a way that's, long term, and kind of dictate that in a way, or at least, tell, as sort of like almost like policy thinking from the bottom up, though, right? Because I don't know, maybe I'm wrong to characterize Project 25. I think of top down. I don't know if that's accurate. I want to cautiously say that, but it's almost like we need something that is far more democratic and bottom up. And when you don't have that, what happens is that some of these funding institutions get to dictate what happens, and people wind up chasing, kind of tail wagging the dog type of thing. And that, I think, has been a problem with so many of the organizations who are part of our sort of like society and our resistance. So that, the process, it will make something of the left to have to go through that process. And the reality is we're going to have to, just to return to the moments that we talked about before, we're going to have to build, we're going to have to become more, we're going to have to become bigger. And that means not reducing ourselves to what people characterize as bread and butter issue, but it does mean figuring out some alignment and having long conversations, and then letting that dictate the day as opposed to funders telling us what we should be doing with our money. So, I mean, with our resources. So that's one thing. I don't know.
One thing I just want to shout out, Zohar Mamdani's mayoral campaign in New York is a great example of kind of a, it's a campaign that's also a kind of a pop-up policy shop, right? And is kind of testing ideas out. And they're great, like free and fast buses and municipally owned grocery stores in, every borough. And
it's good at the internet.
Yeah, he's great at the internet, and he's out in the streets talking about these ideas to people and showing that they're popular. And I mean, it is tricky making policy around electoral campaigns, but there is a way in which it can compensate for some of our weaknesses around lack of control over the media, right? Campaigns are a megaphone, and I don't think they're the only place that we should be developing policy, but they can amplify policy and they can road test them. And so I think that's one thing. The other thing, just to bring, the outside the U.S. into this conversation a little bit, is that, the rest of the world, as we respond to Trump's shocks, right, are having to iterate policies very, very quickly. If he's talking about whatever the latest is, 25% tariffs or, now tariffs on, steel and aluminum or whatever the next surprise is going to be, right? It's forcing these conversations that we should have had a long time ago about ridiculous levels of dependence, certainly in the case of Canada and Mexico, to the U.S., which was always the reason why many of us opposed, bad deals like NAFTA. But we're realizing that we're actually less international on the left than we used to be. That's sort of a lot of these lines of communication that we used to have when we were opposing trade deals like the Free Trade Area of the Americas, which we successfully stopped. We had more communication across the Americas. So some of that is going to be happening around the U.S., but of course it needs to be in conversation with the left inside the U.S., right? And so, one of the things that we're dealing with in Canada is our own sort of aftershock doctrine, right? Where, Trump says, okay, we're going to have these 25% tariffs. Everybody freaks out. But of course, our oil and gas companies, and our tiny corporate consolidated grocery chains are using this shock to say, first of all, buy Canadian, which just means like buying from, our oligarchs. But also, this is why we need to shove every, extractive projects that has been successfully blocked by, indigenous-led resistance, because now we have to sell to China instead of the U.S. And it's all, like lies, China isn't buying it, but it's just using this sense of chaos. So we need to be able to respond. What would an economy that was less vulnerable to these types of shocks look like, right? And that's everything from the right to repair to indigenous-owned renewable energy. The ideas that have been kicking around for a long time and tried, in a smaller scale. But these conversations are happening, and I know when you're really like in the belly of the beast, it's hard to see. But I just want to sort of shout out some of the people who are trying to develop some of this.
Yeah, I mean, I speaking like building on the policy, which is visionary, and then tying it back to something Naomi mentioned, which is, we are in a kind of bind. You mentioned the title of my book, Democracy May Not Exist, but you'll miss it when it's gone. Like, we do have to also think well beyond what we have and then defend what we have. I mean, part of the rights project is that, they're like better funded, but they're like better funded to do an easier job, which is to destroy shit. So they're kind of, whereas the Silicon Valley matter, like move fast and break things. Like, yeah, I could light my house on fire and I could break my house. I could not fucking build my house. It's way harder to make things, let alone to make things fast. And so this is like, I think this is a challenge for us. And, we don't want to do it in the way of the Democratic Party establishment, which became the defender of an indefensible status quo, right? America's already great. We need to defend our democracy, meaning, the flawed democratic process we have. I have listened to enough Steve Bannon to have heard him like crowing about how liberals had become, basically thrown their lot in with the status quo oligarchy that most people despise, right? So we don't want to defend things in that way. And yet we are also kind of conservationists at the same time, right? We want to conserve life on this planet and make things better. So I don't know. Anyway, it's a segue to the fact that, I am inspired in this moment by the federal workers who are organizing and resisting, and many of whom are in flawed bureaucracies and flawed agencies, but are public servants who really care about their work, who did not go to the private sector on purpose, not because they lack talent or skills, but because they have a deeper sense of avocation along with, wanting a vocation. And those folks are rallying and calling for everyone to join them on Wednesday with a movement called Save Our Services, or Day of Action. We should put the link for that in the chat. And I think that they are, a really important movement that weaves together a lot of the elements of this moment, right? Because they're talking about attacks on science, attacks on education, attacks on basic public goods, attacks on our quality of life. So I think that's something that, something that we should all be keeping our eyes out for and supporting in any way. And it is part of this paradoxical dance we have to do of protecting and then remembering that, we also have to present a transformative vision. I actually think public workers are a core part of that because they know how things get done. And many of them would know how to improve things, how to build a seawall more efficiently, right? How to allocate resources with less bureaucracy. Those are the experts we should be looking to, not the boys.
Agreed. I'll just say in the spirit of shouting things out, the AAUP, I encourage everybody who's any related to any institution, please connect with us. Part of what we're trying to do is to make sure that the Academy is sufficiently accountable to communities, not simply, it's not just about the professors, but we have a number of ways we're fighting back, including a number of, we're having some rallies that are going to be happening, I think on the 19th this Wednesday, and also on the 25th. But I would say, I encourage people to connect there. And I think it's about labor. I mean, we're not just as AAUP. Part of what we're doing is we've been working with the UAW locals who also organize various categories of people who work in the university, people who, and then, all kinds of organizations. Obviously, we're in a big partnership with the AFT, which is one of the largest labor organizations in the United States, and they are affected by all this and mobilizing. So when we talked before, at the top of this call, I mean, this is probably obvious to everyone in this call, but labor does have a unique kind of leverage power, right? To be able to, actually like shut things down for real. And so, but it does take a kind of discipline. I see there's a lot of talk where sometimes we'll be like, we should have a general strike. And I'm like, oh, hell yeah, I'm all for it. You're never going to hear me say no to a general strike. But what I think we also have to say yes to is what it really takes to build something like that. And we need to let the people who have that experience in all kinds of labor organizations lead. And I would say that, I guess one other thing I would just say is, there's all kinds of things, Naomi, you mentioned, the Mamdani campaign and DSA played a role, because I guess what I'm speaking about broadly is we on one hand, I would say we who are part of organizations do have to make those entry points for everybody a little bit more clear. And I know a lot of people in movement, I'm hearing people talk about that. That also means if you're someone who's not, part of something and you're going out and you're being mobilized, we should be thinking about how can we engage in a more sustained way? How can we take that further step? So we kind of have to meet each other in those ways to make sure that we don't, that we can sustain, we can build what we need to build. But yeah, definitely labor, I think, is a really important component of it. And that's one thing that we're doing. Is there anything else that people want to shout out in terms of hope? Because, by the way, I know we've been talking about a lot of depressing stuff, but those spaces that also, I don't know, there's a slogan which I can't remember, but it's basically saying like part of the antidote when you're feeling out of it is to get out there and do it. I don't think that means that some people act like you're not allowed to despair. I think we are very much allowed to despair and should, but despair. You can also despair while you're in the movement with people on the move, sort of thing. So, is there anything else folks want to shout out in terms of sources of hope or inspiration, or just places to plug in?
Well, I'll shout out my beloved friends and comrades in JVP, and in the broader movement for Palestinian liberation. As grotesque as Trump's discourse has been, I don't think he will be able to achieve his obscene goals of turning Gaza into the Riviera, and it's because of the strength of the movement. It's hard to call that a victory because it's not a victory. But I know I wouldn't have, I feel so grateful to JVP for leading with love in the way that they have, and putting forward a vision of collective liberation, which is what I think we need, and also building an institution under very difficult circumstances, certain difficult funding circumstances. And I think we've got a lot of bright spots like that, and we need to weave them together. And yeah.
The sanctuary work I want to shout out. There's incredible sanctuary coalitions going on. All of these things are in motion already. So it's not like sometimes we do feel like we're starting from scratch, but I think that we should just say that, that work is expanding. There's all kinds of new coalitions, people who have already been on the move on that, Make the Road and, new sanctuary and all kinds of new things forming around that issue. I do want to just remind you, were talking about that work about no tech, the tech workers, right? No tech for apartheid. I was just looking back at that the other day, and even the Mi Gente work, right? No tech for ICE. I mean, that was just powerful work that's going on by people taking risks, right? Who are in the belly of the beast. I'm mindful of time here. I don't know what else is pressing for us, but I do want to be mindful of time. I mean, is there anything else on our mind? I say, yes, in terms of closing.
I just wanted to say one thing. I think that I guess what I'm hopeful about is that I think what they are, the broad coalition that they imagine themselves as building is fragile. I don't think that people have fully realized it's one thing if you're plugged into this and looking at it all day long. I think for a lot of people, there's something going on. It's not exactly clear what, but I do think that we're at the stage of perhaps of a tsunami where the water is pulling back and has not yet hurled itself forward. And I think that is coming fairly soon, because these cuts that they are implementing recklessly, arbitrarily in the state will have a really, quick impact. And I think that, a lot of Trumpers, maybe there's some aspect that this is what they voted for, to shake things up, to break things. But a lot of people, I don't think so, and I think even beyond that, I think that there are huge sections of public opinion that are with us and that are with what we are talking about. And there's no expression for it because the left is too small, is too weak, is too atomized. The Democratic Party is broken and unable to respond in this moment because it is a core part of the problem itself. And so you have confusion, question, frustration, and no expression for it. There's a huge political vacuum. The right is working overtime to fill it, but there's work to do to respond. And I'm optimistic about that about what it is that we have to say about what's wrong, but more importantly, what can replace this. And that, I think, is the kind of message about life and the human that Naomi is talking about. And this is the trap that liberals fall into, who just want to resuscitate resistance 2.0. And it's not just about resisting, right? I mean, we want to fight and all that, but it's like, what is it that you are fighting for? And it can't just be the restoration of what is being broken. This is the problem. And it can't just be about the corrupt courts that every other day we're against, hoping that they will save us. That's not it either. And so now is the time, these big socialist ideas that we have about what a different world actually could be. What does it mean to say that a different world is possible? Another world is possible. And now's that time to talk about the redistribution of wealth and resources, that working class people are the ones who should be determining what society should look like. Definitely not the oligarchs and the billionaires, but also not their political appointees, not their political stooges. And that's what real democracy could actually look like. And I think that there is space for these politics and for these arguments. And now's the time to make them.
Yeah.
That's it.
No, I mean, I think absolutely. And the pieces are there. I mean, oligarchy has never been more visible, more ridiculous, more on display. I mean, but I think it would be remiss to just not say it is a scary time. And I think some people are scared to act, right? There was a period, right, where it almost felt like everyone was frozen, and then people started to go to the streets. And I think we do have to proceed with caution and be, not be reckless, but we also cannot be immobilized. And I think every action that people do where they get out, I mean, I think that's why I was pointing to these government workers and the rallies that people had across the country today to defend government workers. Healthcare workers disrupted the RFK confirmation hearing. Students disrupted the Linda McMahon confirmation hearing. The World Wrestling Entertainment billionaire who's now, Secretary of Education. And people were nervous about that, and they did it. And they were braver than the politicians, the Democratic Party politicians, who were not pushing back. So I think we have to honor, the fear, but also not be frozen by it, because we are going to have to save ourselves, and we are stronger together. And I'm happy to see people get into motion, and we need more of that. And no action is perfect. No action is the silver bullet, but collectively, they add up.
Yeah, and I would just say, I think we need more international conversations, because we're up against an international movement, right? And there are people all over the world who have been facing this playbook for a long time, and who can offer tips and solidarity strategies. And we need to, some of those conversations are happening, but I think we need more of them. We need a more internationalist left. We need to be very clear that we cannot fight this hyper nationalism with more nationalism, which some countries are trying to do, or some leaders are trying to do. So I think that, standing up for left internationalism as an alternative is something that we need to be doing. And I found myself thinking about a slogan that Evo Morales used to use, which was that there's enough for everyone, but there isn't enough for a few to have more and more and more. And I think that kind of framing is important, because people are living such a reality of scarcity, right? And it's when people feel, Astra wrote a whole book about this, about how conservative a force feelings of insecurity can be, right? So I think we need to prove that enoughness is possible, and that's another way of talking about socialism, which we need to do. The other thing place where I just take inspiration is just, and this is why I'm really harping on this idea that all of these people have escaped fantasies from this place, from this earth. Like, they are getting ready to secede, whether they're going up into their castle in the sky or whether they're going into their little corporate state. They have given up on this world. They have given up on its beauty. They have given up on its people. They have given up on its other species. They have given up on our kids. And that should radicalize us. It should really radicalize us. So we need to get out there and talk about the bleakness of this project, the treasonousness of this project, and really remind ourselves of everything that's worth, and everyone who's worth fighting for. And that's what I mean by there being a kind of like it really being a heart-filled movement, as well as one that really it has righteous rage towards these planetary arsonists and vandals. Yeah. Much love to everybody who's out there and listening, and I know there's such incredible organizers, and I just love being in conversation with all of you.
Same. I like that as a final word. So thank y'all, everyone. Please take care of each other and of yourselves, and
listen to Naomi. That was right.
Yes.
So good.
So good.
All right.